It is a great honor and a privilege to introduce Gerd Korman, Professor Emeritus at Cornell University. Not only are you a Holocaust survivor, but you became a pioneer and one of the forerunners of establishing the study of Holocaust in American academia. And Gerd, your family history about the Shoah encapsulates, I think, so many facets of the Shoah, of our Jewish history. It's just the most amazing story, what happened to your family and how you survived, and all the different aspects of the Shoah are included in your story, which is just phenomenal. So if you could tell us a little bit about your family, how they got to Germany, the origins on your father's side and your mother's side, and then a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm not sure how much I actually remember or know as a historian, but on my father's side, they came from a little town called Narol in Galicia. Narol is essentially a suburb of Lemberg, and they were Belzer Hasidim. Big family. I got to know a few of them. A brother of my father and some other relatives. I met some of my relatives when we were deported to Spongin. Partly, I think, because they came to visit us. I think. Because it was just before the war. But my father's relatives kept an eye on us somehow once we were deported to Spongin in Poland. And we remained in Spongin until we left for England and the United States. My father had much the worst of it, because my father originally left the three of us in Spongin, going back to Germany, hoping to get to the United States.
But can I just ask you, can we go back to the origins?
Yes.
Your mother's family, where did she come? They come from?
My mother's family, my immediate family, when I first got to meet them, lived in Germany, in Wuppertal, which is a town near Cologne. That family had migrated from Galicia some decades before. And that family had 3 children. My mother and her 2 brothers. One of those brothers, the older one, was Oswald Laufer. And Oswald Laufer early on became a Reichsbanner, a social democrat that had a militant wing. And he was the one who actively fought National Socialists in the streets of his town, Wuppertal.
We have a picture of Oswald, and I think he was killed.
He was murdered, right. He was murdered by a gang of 5 Nazis who shot him in front of his parents' household. Right. And Oswald's memory is treasured in Wuppertal itself by a number of people who have annual memorials in his name and have kept his memory alive.
I think you were in 1998. We have a picture of you with your brother Manfred.
Yes.
With a plaque where the city put up a plaque in his memory.
Right.
And when were you born?
I was born in Hamburg. No.
Your Manfred was born in Hamburg.
No, I was born in Wuppertal, in the Rhineland, because that's where my mother's family came from. They had migrated from Galicia and had come to settle in Wuppertal, or Elberfeld as it was called.
And you were born back in July the 24th, 1928.
Yeah, right.
It's incredible.
Wuppertal was also, I think I have this right, the birthplace of Goebbels.
And I think Engels was...
The infamous Goebbels. Mm-hmm. I think he came out of Wuppertal also. Wuppertal is a famous textile town for a number of years. And we visited Wuppertal quite often.
I think you mentioned in your book Marx and Engels also had a connection to the town. Karl Marx and Engels.
Yes, well, that's because there was a very strong socialist element in the Wuppertal area, but that came also to mean there was a very strong Nazi element in Wuppertal.
And then your family moved to Hamburg?
My parents met, so the story goes, my parents met on a Hanover railway station and were married in Wuppertal, which then was known just as Elberfeld. I'm blocking on the rabbi who married them, but he became quite famous in reform circles, German reform circles, German Jewish reform circles. And they moved to Hamburg early in their married life, where he was the traveling salesman. Also a Zionist. Not a labor Zionist, it was a middle-class Zionist. And we lived there until the deportation.
And your brother Manfred was born 3.5 years later?
After me, yes.
And what are your earliest recollections of Hamburg, or what is your earliest recollections of growing up?
My
earliest recollections.
Oh, the earliest recollection. Well, I've long had the sense that with the deportation in 1938, I lost a good deal of my memory. The trauma of that deportation experience cost me a lot of my memory. Bits and pieces of came back, but most of it, I think, was gone. So what I do remember are little bits and pieces here and there. So one of the experiences that was dearest to me is that I became a young kid who loved to play soccer. And I guess one of the reasons I loved to play soccer is because I became pretty good at it. But I also had a marvelous experience in the Jewish parochial school in Hamburg. that came under the direction of a gentleman whose last name was Spear, and under the general direction of Rabbi Karlebach, who was one of Hamburg's great rabbis, and who is remembered in many circles as having gone with his congregation and to his death when the Nazis deported his family and with others out of Hamburg and into Eastern Europe, right? I got to know Rabbi Karlebach as a kid because I sang in the choir of the Orthodox synagogue of Hamburg, where he was chief rabbi. And so in one way or another, I had some contact with Rabbi Karlebach, which to him, I'm sure, wasn't of any consequence, but which to me as a young boy was very much of consequence. I sang in the choir of the Bornplatz synagogue, and I think I mentioned it in Nightmare's Fairy Tale. I think so. But I remember the experience of being in that choir, because I was among the youngest with the high soprano. But I also was the kid who invariably got into mischief.
So, Prof, you remember singing in the choir?
Oh yes, oh yes. I also remember getting into trouble in the choir. Trouble instigated by the older boys. And finally, I think they got rid of me because I was part of a group with the choir who got into trouble and mischief. Right. Right.
And your school? Do you remember? You had fond memories of your school?
Right. In the few years before we were deported, I attended the Talmud Torah Schule of Hamburg, which had quite a reputation and maintained its reputation after the war. It was the synagogue that was connected with Karlebach's synagogue, but it was a modern German Orthodox shul and school, both. As I remember, as a kid, very demanding school, but I managed to survive. So I was still going to that school when we were deported.
And did you have mainly Jewish friends, or did you have any non-Jewish friends?
Oh no, all my friends were Jewish. I think, as I wrote in Nightmare's Fairy Tale, we lived in one part of Hamburg before the Nazi period really struck. And then my parents were forced to move into the Jewish parts of Hamburg that developed around the Karlebach synagogue. I don't know anything about, through personal experience, of the period before we moved into the more Jewish quarter. Because when I was born, first in Wuppertal, and then brought to Hamburg by my parents. We lived away from where the main synagogue was. And then under the Nazi regime, we became part of the population that was increasingly concentrated in an inner part of Hamburg, not far from that school we were talking about before.
And Gerd, do you remember when Hitler came to power and the Nazi youth, or do you remember Nazi?
I remember, but the way I remember, but the way I remember it is really as a youngster with his childhood interests and friends, which is to say, I was very conscious of the arrival of the Hitler regime, partly because my mother's brother was murdered as a Reichsbanner. So that was an event in 1933. So from the very beginning, in my particular family, the arrival of Nazis to power came with his murder. As a child, under those circumstances, I was aware of his murder, largely because my mother took me to the gravesite of Oswald in Wuppertal. But we were living in Hamburg. She went back to visit her parents periodically. My memory of life as a young Jewish kid in Hamburg was such a mixture of experiences. On the one hand, I remember riding the subway from a section of Hamburg that was some distance away from where the Talmud Torah Schule was, which meant I took the subway to go to school.
And you did it by yourself?
Yeah, like many kids. But it also meant I usually was carrying Jewish books. And I don't remember much in detail about the subway rides, except one day, out of the clear blue, I found myself in the lap of a Nazi official, maybe an SS official, I don't know, he was in uniform. It was a crowded subway. He put me on his lap, and that was the closest I ever got to a Nazi official.
And you were carrying your books, which were in Hebrew?
Oh, it was all there. It was all there. But nobody hurt me, nobody touched me. I mean, we were fellow passengers. So, in those years, which must have been 36, 37, there was still a lot of coexistence, which, individual Nazi officials tolerated or ordinary Nazi officials tolerated. I was aware of having become part of the Jewish population that was forced to resettle in a particular part of Hamburg. Ghetto-like, but not really a ghetto. And I recall quite vividly, as I think I write about in the book, traveling with my parents from Hamburg to Lübeck and seeing in Lübeck all kinds of Nazi paraphernalia and photographs and paintings or whatever. In other words, it was a trip right through the early months of Nazi Germany.
Did you ever experience any anti-Semitism that you can recall?
No, the only anti-Semitism I directly experienced was seeing signs out on the sidewalks where I walked in Lübeck about no Jews being allowed and things of that sort. My uncle's murder hovered over our family from the moment it happened.
So we have a lovely...
He came to visit us, my uncle did, in Hamburg, before he was murdered.
So good, we have a wonderful picture in 1934 or 35 with you and your mother and Manfred in Hamburg. And then you also went to the beach. Do you remember taking the train going to the beach?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, because the beach wasn't segregated yet, so far as I remember. I mean, it's quite possible it was segregated, and I just wasn't aware of it.
And you and Manfred, you had a special bond?
Pardon?
You and your brother, you had a special connection, a special bond? You were very close with your brother, with Manfred?
Yes. Well, the deportation was traumatic. And in my memory, the deportation changed everything.
So that was on a Friday, October the 28th, 1938. Right. What do you recall about that deportation? It must have been such a trauma to be...
Yeah, it was. And I think I captured it quite well in the book, because it was such a dramatic event and so sudden. So from the moment a local police officer, actually a local policeman, arrested us, I entered a different world, namely a prisoner. I became a prisoner of the Nazi regime as a child. And I was quite conscious of it. And what I became so conscious of, and what remains with me, has remained with me a long, long time, is the awareness that my father had lost complete control over me as a child. Because I don't quite know why I became so conscious of it, but I did. Every step he took, and my mother took, were by Nazi command, either up there or somewhere middle range or whatever. But I became very aware as a child that my parents had lost complete control over me. I was all of 7 years old. And I tried to capture this moment in Nightmare's fairy tale where the train had already arrived from Hamburg through Essen and in Spongin. The arrival in Spongin was very dramatic because the train stopped in the German part of the border country. And it was there that the full impact of our condition really hit me as a child, because the train had stopped and we, as captured Jewish prisoners and train riders, were suddenly taken off the train, and our fathers disappeared. They didn't disappear very far because we were all lined up on a railway station, and the officials who ran this show called out the names of the people whose passports they had or whatever. And so I saw, and my brother saw, my father, having been called by name, having to walk this, what I thought was a long railway platform, and then came back with his papers. I remembered from that point on that somehow I knew he had lost complete control over me. In retrospect, I often thought about this moment, but I really think it's an honest and correct reconstruction that here is this 10-year-old boy who at some level understands completely that his father had lost absolute control over him. Because I was on the platform with my mother and brother, and some Nazi official toward the far end of the platform was calling out his name, like they had called out other names. And so he had to walk a portion of that platform to those officials. And if you're in my position as a 10-year-old, you're not quite sure where he's going until you realize that he was coming back. And he was coming back with his passport papers. Because now, just before the border crossing, the physical border crossing, the Nazi guards in army gave us back our papers, so that when we went into a no man's land, we had our papers. But that's where they pushed us from the train station platform that was in the German town of Neubenchen towards the land border between Germany and Poland. On the one side, the western side, was this little town of Neubenchen. As I learned soon enough, on the Polish side was a town called Spongin. So the Nazis now organized us in such a way that we would march quickly from German territory into no man's land territory, in which German soldiers and troops suddenly appeared in very organized fashion. Up to that point, soldiers had walked with us as we were deported from the German town of Neubenchen, walked towards the physical land border with Poland. And it was, I try to write about this actually, and it was at this point that these German soldiers who had been walking alongside of us, I think we walked about 3 kilometers, suddenly deployed. I mean, that's a term I learned to use afterwards. But suddenly they deployed in disciplined army fashion, whereas before they were just sort of armed stragglers who were walking along with us. Now suddenly they turned into a German soldier, police soldier formation. So they were on the right and on the left of this group of Jews, and then they formed a kind of chain behind us. And that's how we entered no man's land, because these land borders have a section that's technically and legally considered no man's land. No man's land meaning the Germans don't control it and the Poles don't control it. They have an agreement that neither control it. So we were very conscious of the fact that we were entering this no man's land, which meant we had no police or soldier protection from whatever side. And I was very conscious of it because I didn't know who was in front of us initially, but I certainly knew who was behind us, because the Germans had deployed in a real special formation so that they could have a right flank and a left flank and a human chain behind us.
And do you remember the bayonets?
Yes, I certainly do. I do. Because my father, who had been a soldier in the Polish army, as best as I could remember now, can remember now and had remembered before, and you have to realize I talk about a memory that I've talked about a memory before, that it's possible there's a garbled version in all of this. But I think I still have it pretty straight. Namely, that the German military or police military deployed. And they deployed in such a way that they formed a chain behind this group of deported Jews that they were pushing forward. They didn't know, but suspected what would face them in Polish territory, and the Germans no doubt had figured this all out, knew exactly that there were only 3 Polish soldiers guarding this particular spot. So now you have a well-armed German military force pushing thousands of Jews across a land border which was faced by 3 Polish soldiers. Someone knew really what they had planned and what they were doing.
And you were deported because your father was Polish?
we were deported because my father was identified as a Pole with a Polish citizenship and deported because by that time the Nazi regime had made a decision that those Jews who were identified as Polish Jews no longer had the protection of the German state. That what we've been talking about are unarmed civilians ranging in age from, let's say where I am now, to children who are still nursing and were still carrying their luggage and had absolutely no idea what was happening, what was waiting for them. And we were in this, somehow we knew, or someone told us, we were in no man's land. Most people have never heard of no man's land. But no man's land was the name that I associated, term that I associated with land over which neither Germany nor Poland claimed jurisdiction. So it sat between these two national borders, and the German government with its military force had pushed us with fixed bayonets into this territory, which was no man's territory. They had no business there, but they pushed us into it anyway, right? And they, at this frontier, they faced 3 Polish soldiers. So you have to imagine a well-armed, highly disciplined German military unit pushing thousands of people into the face of 3 armed Polish soldiers. What I remember about that particular moment was just the motion and the awareness that we were in territory that was very scary, and suddenly hearing a shot. At which point, everybody among the Jews hit the ground. Perhaps because of what my father said to his family, others said to their family, quick, lie down. They suddenly remembered all their training in the Polish army during World War I. So, we take our suitcases and put them in front of our faces. And my father, I don't know, I guess he had sufficient sense where he was, managed to have his family hang back because he didn't want to get caught in the crossfire. So we were close to the Germans and their open bayonets. And there was the shot. We hear the shot, and everybody just falls flat, putting their suitcases up in front of their faces. And then there's silence, as I remember. Silence. Which was followed by what seems like, in retrospect, a human tidal wave. It suddenly, as people got to their feet in response to I don't know what, I think either at the time I saw it or immediately thereafter people were talking about it. A couple of Jews in the front lines of that deported element got up after they heard the shot and overran the 3 Polish soldiers. They had no choice but to let us run across the border, because 3 armed Polish soldiers are not going to stop thousands of people backed up by high-powered military forces of the German government. So, with that, the Germans had achieved their goal. Namely, they had pushed us into no man's land, controlled us in no man's land, which they had no authority to do, and then engineered a situation where we ran from one part of no man's land that the Germans were supposed to respect but didn't, into the Polish part of the no man's land, which they couldn't control, to patches of grass where we could collapse, having decided we had run across the border. And at that point, as I recall, most people gave into a sense of complete collapse. Complete collapse. They realized the Poles were not going to kill them, even though they fired some shots, maybe they were blanks in the air. And the Germans had let go of us. So we were nowhere and everywhere. And then suddenly, a couple of people in front, very courageous, in the face of 3 Polish soldiers. Amen. They got up and overran the 3 Polish soldiers. And with that, everybody ran and collapsed. And we were running with our luggage. And mothers and fathers were running with their little ones. And we just collapsed on Polish soil. Didn't take very long before people like my father recognized that local Poles, whom they knew, didn't like Jews either, were coming towards us with horse and wagon. And as I recall, I remember hearing my father say, "Don't give them anything." And sure enough, they were coming to collect the luggage and to keep it. And he was instructing us to somehow hold on to, because we didn't know whether they were armed or unarmed. I mean, the child had absolutely no idea, but for that matter, neither did the adults. had no idea who was controlling whom. And I think for a few moments after the border crossing, no one controlled anything. We were on Polish territory, and soon enough, Poles came to take our luggage, ostensibly to help us. But many came to steal our luggage. So my father, in his great wisdom and knowledge of Polish anti-Jewish behavior, worked very hard that we hang on, don't give them anything, hold on to your luggage, hold on to everything. So we did, and we held on to it. In any event, from that point forward, other actors came into play. The Germans had done their work, right? The Polish defense soldiers had done their work. So now it was the question of who would come for us or towards us. Nobody really knew. And in that really quite complex competing authorities, which meant no authority for a moment, people somehow managed to hold together somehow. And the first thing that I remember of some kind of organized response to our physical deportation was the arrival of horses in our direction. And I learned soon enough that those horses coming into our direction had been released from their stables so that we could get into them as the new residents. We took the horses out and put us Jews in. And that transition opened up a whole new chapter for us, because it meant that we were under Polish jurisdiction, and the Poles were quite happy to let Polish Jewish organizations come in and help them as much as they could. So on the other side of the Polish border, Jewish organizations participated with Polish organizations to somehow deal with this little mass of humanity.
We have a picture in your book where you show just people arriving and totally lost.
In Spongin.
In Spongin, yeah.
That you have to drink.
Yeah,
You have to
there's
drink.
another.
Is that juice or ginger?
It's water. Do you want some juice?
No, what is that?
It's water.
That's water?
And you remember being in the stables? You remember?
Oh, yes, for
That's where they
sure.
lived.
Oh, for sure. Not so much the stable, as I remember having seen the horses come out, and then being with my parents, somehow in control over part of a big straw sack, or the whole straw sack, I can't remember now which. But certainly we had part of a straw sack where our little family unit settled in with others who had been pushed across the border. And that lasted for quite a number of hours. And in that period of time, Jewish refugee organizations had arrived. And I remember hearing them give talks in Yiddish and stuff, which of course I didn't really understand. But I learned afterwards that the Joint Distribution Committee and others out of Warsaw immediately sent their people into Spongin to somehow cope with this impossible situation. Because we were in a stable, a huge stable. And I guess after a while there were mattresses that appeared. I don't know if they were the mattresses on which the horses lived or some other creatures. I don't know. I didn't know then. I never bothered to find out. But I think I'm right in saying that Jewish Polish organizations moved to heaven and earth to try to help us.
And they provided food and...
Tried everything.
And good, I just want to mention, amongst the deportees that were sent was the, and I think your family knew, they knew the Gispan family. Gispan. The Gispan family.
They dispensed?
The Gispan family. Where they were also deported, and their son Herschel, that's a whole story about Herschel who was in Paris and he heard about his parents being deported. And he shot the German diplomat.
No, that's right. My parents...
They knew the family.
We had relatives who were on the deportation trains from Essen. And as I recall now, the parents of the young man who was murdered in Paris also came from there.
Greenspan.
It was Herschel. Their son Herschel was in Paris, and he shot the diplomat, and that was... the Germans used that as a precursor for Kristallnacht.
That's what they said, right.
He shot Ernst van Roth.
But for us, the encounter with that family was had nothing to do with anything like that.
But your family knew? They knew the family?
That was all in the future.
Daddy, did your family know the Greenspan family?
I don't know. I don't think so.
But they were part of the deportees that were with your family.
Right. I mean, we got to know who that was soon enough, but in the immediate moment, I don't remember. We have relatives who came in, who was in this deportation. They had been shipped in from Essen, and as I remember now, that family you were talking about had come on that train from Essen too. I think. If it really matters, you have to double check.
It's just amazing the link in Jewish history, what happened. It's just...
Right.
And when did you go to the mill?
To the?
The mill.
The mill.
The mill. Ah. I don't have the chronology straight in my head, but maybe I never did. But I think it took the Jewish agencies that were active, like the Joint Distribution Committee, who they were forced to deal with an impossible situation. because this was in the experiences of those Jewish organizations in Poland, most of the time at first, in the committee organization, of having to deal with thousands of refugees suddenly planted at their door. But they somehow managed by themselves, for all I knew, without the aid of the Polish government, but with the permission of the Polish government. Very important to remember, with the permission of the Polish government. They set up a whole supply and distribution system so that we had something to eat, we had something with which to cover our bodies, and with which to stay up the first night, being afraid to go to sleep.
Oh, sorry.
So those were the conditions initially that introduced us to straw sacks, which by the kind act of horses that had been there before but had been let out were now available for us without anybody changing any sheets or anything of that sort. We had their beds, and we lived with their beds for quite a while. Quite a while, meaning, I think, at least 3 days and nights. At least. Yeah.
And do you remember going to the mall?
Pardon?
Do you remember going to the mall?
The hall?
The mall.
The mill?
Yeah.
Well, that was a very different experience because we went from the stable to different kinds of housing arrangements. Yes.